All right. Okay. So welcome everybody. This is a NYJS meetup on Enterprise Node. In this episode specifically, we're going to be talking about code quality. So I'm just going to give about a minute or two to let some people filter in if they're going to. In the meantime, on the polls tab, there are a couple of polls that I would ask that everybody go ahead and just take a second and fill out. I just ask that obviously you leave this webinar one until the end. Everything else you're pretty much free to fill out as you see fit. Okay, so while we wait for anybody else to filter in over the next 2 to 3 minutes, I'm just going to give just a minor background about myself. So my name is Curtis Kemple. I'm a tech lead here at Major League Soccer. You can find me on Medium, Twitter, and GitHub. I've been with Major League Soccer now for coming up on a year. It's been a very interesting road. We've done a lot of work over the last year to kind of overhaul how we handle Node. We have a lot of JavaScript in our environments and deal with anywhere between 15 to 30 private Node modules within a given week. We run about coming up on close to 20 node services. So when you start getting up to that level of JavaScript, as you can imagine, it gets pretty hard to handle. So the whole focus of this series is really on enterprise. We're not going to be getting too much into code level stuff because you can pretty much find that anywhere else. What we're actually looking for here is how to take and get an outside view of our applications so we can measure trends, monitor performance of applications and developers, which is equally as important. We like to measure churn against quality of code. That's a very great metric to tell when developers are overworked or experiencing burnout. And we'll be talking about a lot more about these things here in a little bit. But I just want to set the standard that this won't be an in-depth coding webinar. This is going to be more about tools, options, standards, and how to integrate them into your workflow to really increase the visibility into your applications. For series, a lot of the information that is discussed, you can see as an example in this repository. It's under KKemple, Awesome Enterprise Web Service. So it's really just a boilerplate example of how to get spun up with an enterprise type web service very quickly. I'm not going to go too deep into all that it includes. You can find all that out in the wiki for that repo, but you'll see me referencing it here and there throughout the talk and actually through following talks. And it's a great repository to mess around with, start to understand how these things are working together. And also, this is an open question webinar. I prefer you ask questions as we go. This will allow us to kind of keep the conversation rolling. If you happen to miss a section and you have a question about something that we've talked about and have moved on from, just go ahead and ask it. And we're going to actually have a Q&A session at the end after we're done with the presentation, and that should give you a chance for any follow-up questions. Okay, so seems like people have had a chance to kind of funnel in, seeing poll results coming in, so thank you for that. This is very useful information for me. It's good to know and see what people are using, what experience they have, so that it helps set the tone for how far in depth we should be going here. Okay, great. So we're just going to take another minute first, and we're going to talk about what is enterprise. So as you can tell, the course is actually titled Enterprise Node.js. So what makes something enterprise, right? Like, I mean, there's tons of companies using Node. It's obviously one of the most popular language in the market. There's no denying that. So why isn't everything enterprise, right? And I guess we kind of have to like look at redefining what exactly enterprise means. If you do some research and you look it up, I think Microsoft's example is probably the best one. And it states that basically any service that is business critical, that your business, is enterprise. However, it's not really very accurate anymore. So this is a statement that's very true in a day when not everything was web-based. However, I mean, pretty much everything now is powered by JavaScript or some type of technology. So we kind of have to look at a different metric to measure just what is enterprise node and what separates it from, just a standard SaaS solution or a smaller, circle of service. So I guess another metric that you could look at is it largely JavaScript environment? This is kind of accurate. However, if we have a very small environment, we only have two services, say, one API and a worker, technically you could call that enterprise, I guess, but that's still a very small amount. It's pretty easy to wrap your head around two services in their dependencies. I would say what really makes something enterprise would be any large organization that handles anywhere between 15 30, oh, that's nice, 15 to 30 different packages or sorry, I'm having technical difficulties with my PowerPoint presentation. Let me fix. Hey, sorry about that. I can't believe that. So we got dropped off there. That was because I had the wrong window focused when I tried to quit PowerPoint. I do apologize for that. So let's just reopen this and get started again. All right, please forgive me for that one. I do apologize. There we go. Everything seems to be back to normal. Okay, great. So as I was saying, I guess what really defines enterprise is anytime when you use more modules or services as a team or teams than you could possibly manage without some type of automation on your own. So once your code starts to scale beyond your teams, you're starting to basically experience enterprise. There's a lot of ways, though, to wrangle your code back into order that will allow you, with a very small team, to actually move extremely fast, pretty much no matter how much JavaScript you start to take under your umbrella. And one of the biggest factors of this is code quality. It's more important for developers to be able to move about between projects and easily be able to recognize styles, pick up patterns, and move through code. On any given day, I might work on 3 or 4 different services, and like I said, be any number of node modules / actual node projects that are aggregating these modules and dependencies. It would be pretty much impossible for me to do my job if we didn't have pretty advanced analytics and build processes set up to help us monitor and be able to move quickly and not have to stop at every turn to think about what I need to be doing, how my code should be looking, etc. So all right, let's actually start diving in here. So we've already discussed just briefly why code quality is important, but we're going to take a look at some actual definable metrics that help sum this up. So one of the major benefits, obviously, is it prevents entropy. So as I'm saying, JavaScript, one of the great benefits of it is it allows you to move quickly. It's what draws people to JavaScript. It's what is making JavaScript take over the enterprise environment and replace Java, .NET, and Ruby. You can get much more done in a faster time frame with less resources. However, with that amount of churn, tends to come a lot of mess or spaghetti. It doesn't help that JavaScript is both dynamically and weakly typed. And so a quick side note, dynamic typing means that there's no set typing. Variables can be of any type and cast any type. once they are instantiated. And weak typing means that you can actually compare against types. A great example of this is double and equals. So double equals compares weak type. If you have a string of 1 and a number of 1, that will actually be truthy. However, if you triple equals against a string 1 and a number 1, it's falsy. And that is because the first one checks value and the second one checks value and type. So when you have such a dynamic language where you can pretty much program the same application in a million different ways, it's very easy to start to accrue tech debt. It's very easy to start to skip out on style patterns and take little shortcuts to get that feature released by Wednesday or whenever the next push is that your project or product manager is calling for. These little things start to build up, and if they go unchecked or monitored, if they're not being analyzed, it's going to slip by you, and the next person who comes through, it's going to slip by until you end up with these tribal projects that have just slipped into a state where only a few people know how to deal with them. They're kind of like a black box. Nobody wants to really look at it or change it, God forbid, because they have no idea what it's going to affect. So a lot of these issues that you see people actually trying to solve with architectural solutions can be mitigated greatly just by using code quality analysis. Microservices is the big term these days. Everybody's throwing it around. Slice up your monolith, slice up your monolith. And while I do agree that that is true at a certain point, services definitely need to be broken apart by their domain, I've noticed a trend where people start to slice into services maybe a lot sooner than they should. And the reason why is because they start to end up with a lot of tech debt or just general entropy. And nobody wants to go in and say, hey, we should just clean this up. It's easier to rewrite as a service. So entropy is the number one. The second is that it improves velocity. It allows you to work faster. Context switching is the greatest detriment to a developer's productivity. When I have to stop working on a particular service and start looking at something, I notice this biggest when I jump between languages. We also have some Golang services that we maintain. And when I move from JavaScript to Go, it takes me a few minutes to get in that flow. It takes me a while. And I've noticed this, that when JavaScript projects aren't built the same and they're not styled the same, it takes me a while to get used to those practices and patterns in a new project. However, when we've standardized on a coding style and we've standardized on particular architectural patterns, opening one service or node module to the next, it just becomes very easy to move about, understand where things are. I have more reliability in it. I know that if I make any mistakes, it will be caught. So it's very, very empowering and allows me to move at a speed much faster, not to mention removing manual checks. I can just, commit, run some checks locally. If things are looking good, throw it up onto the build server. And if anything is going awry, my build server will catch it. So code quality helps there as well. And the last one that this doesn't really get discussed very much is it actually increases developer morale. The harder it gets to work through a project and the less people want to touch it, obviously, the less fun it is to develop with. This can create very toxic, stressful environments for developers. It makes it very hard to do your job, and really the quality of code, not just stylistically, but the actual features and things that are being pushed out starts to degrade as well. People don't care about it as much, and basically this is how an app becomes a legacy app or service. These three things: entropy, or just basically no code quality, right? So if we're not preventing entropy, we're on our way to legacy. So these are pretty much some of the main benefits. Another one that I didn't mention here because it's more from a managerial standpoint is the insight that it provides. As I was talking before, you can actually build trends off of this. And we'll look at some services that we use later that help us analyze the quality of our code bases and provide insight into exactly how that code base has improved or degraded over time. And like I said, you can use that to flag alerts. Like if we notice that we're pushing out a lot of features and we start to increase developer churn, in other words, there's more commits happening to these projects more frequently. Well, if we can track that against degradation in code quality, then we can say that we're obviously moving too fast, right? So if code quality is starting to slip, one of two things is happening. We're either getting too much work coming through, or we need more resources. So one of two needs to be fixed. And this is great. This actually gives development leads an actual visibility metric to come back and provide to others to get those resources or to get those features pushed into the next sprint. This is great. I mean, just coming up to your boss and saying, hey, I'm tired, or hey, man, the team's pretty tired this week. It's much harder to get that across without having metrics, right? So numbers speak. Numbers speak. All right. So what defines quality code? So we've discussed that it's important, right? Code quality is very important, but really, like, what defines quality code? What can you say? Hey, you know what? This code base, it's got all its bases covered. It looks great. I feel comfortable moving around in here. Well, the way I like to refer to it the most, and seems to be the easiest to get across and explain, is it's really the 3 C's of code quality. So the first one being clarity, right? If a code base is not easy to read, if styling is all over the place, this is going to directly affect velocity. The more time that I have to spend familiarizing myself, the more time that I'm wasting that I could be working on something else or improving something. So clarity is tough. This really falls under, the style guides as far as variable and function naming. It really goes down to how you do that, how you're deciding whether or not to use ES6 classes, or these type of decisions. The code needs to be clear and repeatable. It should always be a repeatable pattern. The next biggest measurement and the next C is complexity. Complexity is a pretty interesting topic, and we're going to cover each of these in more detail here in just a second. But complexity has a great way of creeping in. And to dive more into this, I'm actually talking about cyclomatic complexity, which we'll discuss in a second. But essentially, the more complex methods, services, classes get, the more state a developer has to hold in their head in order to work with it. So anytime that you can mitigate complexity or reduce it, you're actually reducing the amount of information other developers need in their head to work with your code. And again, this directly applies to velocity, because it's faster and easier for me to work through code that is less complex, and it actually leads to more reliable software. So we're not really going to discuss testing too much in this webinar, but I am considering adding another webinar to this series of 4 just focused on testing, because it is such a vital part of quality systems. But complexity, minimal complexity, leads to easy testing. So that's also something to keep in mind. And the last one is coverage. So again, this comes back to testing, not the actual test itself. But coverage is a very important indicator of the quality of a system. So we're going to get more into coverage here. Coverage is basically, it's a touchy subject. There's a lot of differing opinions about it. So we're going to cover that in more detail. So I won't jump too much into it, but just that coverage is a great indicator and provides confidence to developers. If I make changes, I can run my tests, and I know immediately that whether or not I'm green. So now let's step back. Coverage is not equal to the presence of stability, but lack of coverage is equal to the presence of instability. So what that means is just because you have coverage doesn't mean everything's perfect and it's definitely a stable system, but lack of coverage means we have no idea if it's stable, right? If nothing is covered, then we essentially have no security blanket. We can't change anything without wondering what else we're going to break. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. It looks like I'm getting some +1s on testing. All right, cool. So I'll look at adding a webinar for testing. All right, so now we're going to talk about each one of the C's in just a little bit more detail. So I just want to share this first and give everybody a minute to read this, because when I saw this, I was just dying laughing. So basically this is saying, without a style guide, you're going to end up with just some crazy mess, which is true, because as people, we want to move quickly. We want to get things done. A lot of times we want to move on to new features, and a missing semicolon or a semicolon when we don't use any, doesn't seem like a lot, and it's really not a lot. It's not. It's just the aggregation over time that becomes a lot. And so it's just very interesting that clarity is actually pretty overlooked. And again, I need to stress too, this is not just like, do we use trailing commas or do we not? It's if your variable names give context and meaning, and your function names give context. Like function Batman is of no help to anybody, but function, delete branch from GitHub, that's like a great function name. You know what I mean? So it's you definitely want to use best judgment. But yeah, so all right, let's dive in. So what exactly does clarity mean? So again, it means the code is formatted well, using same amount of indentation. We're using the same style of if-else brackets, or for any type of scopes. We're using the same block styles, all that good stuff. It means that the code is cohesive. This is a big piece that is missed as well. Things that belong together are together. This is a pattern that is also becoming more prevalent. I actually just read a great article by Kent C. Dodds, and maybe I can dig that up really quick and share it in the chat. But basically, he talks about how we keep comments co-located next to our code. And we do this because it doesn't really make sense to take your comments and put them out into a separate file or a separate directory and build them, because they're related to a very specific thing. Not only if you did put them somewhere else is it likely to just become outdated and stale, but it's also a good chance that people won't know where to go to look for it. They won't know pretty much that it even exists. And so these are the type of things that, here we go, I found it. Sorry, bear with me. Cool. So these are the type of problems that we face when we don't have cohesion. So now this plays a much bigger part when you're actually dealing with code. We want everything to be next to each other. I want my tests next to my source files, and I want to group features together. And so basically what I'm talking about here is the pattern of cohesion over functionality. So what that means is we get a new feature for stars, right, on GitHub. Let's say we're GitHub. So in our project, we create this new feature. We create and we add everything under there, the routes, everywhere, controllers, whatever it is that we're building, everything exists under that one file. Whereas when we group by functionality, you'll have like a folder of controllers and or maybe a routes file, and and then you have all these handlers, and they're all grouped together by what they do, or what they are. Actually, they're not grouped by what they do, because if they were grouped by what they do, they would be grouped by feature. They're just grouped by what they are. And generally that's not the best way to group things, right? We want cohesion, because if I have to traverse 200 JavaScript files to find the corresponding controller to my routes file, it's a huge detriment to time. So again, you're directly affecting velocity. So you want cohesion. You want to keep the things that are together. And so lastly, this we already said, but variable and function names give context. All right, so we want to be sure that we are actually describing the work that we are doing or the state that we are holding. And again, can't express how important this is. Your code should be your first level of documentation. And that's a very important statement. And so when you think about it, when you read your code, and this is not always possible. Sometimes you do hit complexity that just is very hard to make very clear, or it seems like kind of a backwards way to do it. And you want to try to isolate that complexity as much as possible and add documentation next to it, right? Like comments about it. But as a whole, for 90% of the things that I've ever developed, I was able to actually give contextual names to everything. If I had applied myself, it's rare that you'll run into just something that is so complex that you can't be broken apart. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about complexity. So this is the actual definition, Wikipedia, which is a little much. So basically, it's a metric used to indicate linearly independent paths through a program's source code. In other words, really what it's measuring is how much, at a function level, it's saying how complex is this method, like how many statements, how many other method calls exist within this. It's essentially like saying that your project should have as little cross communication between different types of oh, here we go. So we are getting the 3 C's are, quick question, clarity, complexity, and coverage. And these slides are available. So I'm not sure if you guys see the button yet, but there is a link to the slides. The slides are on SlideShare. So you can catch up at any time. You can download them afterwards. And again, also, if you miss any questions or you have some more questions, feel free to ask the question here in chat. And there will be a Q&A time at the end, again, for more, filtered questions. Okay, so back to cyclomatic complexity. Essentially, what we're saying here is how much does the code that I'm using, one, use other code, and two, is used by other code, right? So how much is this used elsewhere and how much am I using inside of it? And so you can kind of build up this diagram, this tree, right? Like, and it tries to find linearly independent paths. So a linearly independent path means it's not used, it's not using much code, like any code internally, and is used by like only one other place, right? Like that's a linear path from A to B. If, however, it has two things using it, C and D, right? So now we have C and D coming into A and A going to B, we're no longer linear, right? And so then as we start to build up this kind of graph, you can almost think of like a graph database, then you start to add complexity, right? If the path is linear and we can follow it straight from start to finish, it's very non-complex, right? Like walking a straight line. Oh, great. Somebody just shared an article on cyclomatic complexity. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, and it's funny because I actually have a link to one as well. So basically, if everything, that I have just said has left you a bit lost, this blog post is a great blog post. Let me see if I can, on basically the roots of static analysis and cyclomatic complexity, and it kind of really breaks it down in layman's terms. So it'll kind of help, lighten the subject. But basically, the point is we want code that isn't overused and doesn't overuse other parts of our system, right? So again, talking about the monolith and everybody slicing up the monolith, a big problem is when you try and develop a system that handles everything, the cross-talking gets really big. It's hard to put up dividers to have these like segregated, cohesive sections where you don't reach in and call methods from other parts or drag them in, where you're using pub subbing or, some type of eventing system or any other type of abstraction to get loose coupling. So Another reason, again, that you see people just start breaking apart applications is because they've let complexity get out of hand. And so it could have been mitigated from the start. And even if not, it might not need to be chopped up yet. Maybe you just start adding the complexity and just start targeting the bad areas that, complexity analysis, and start targeting the areas that you're seeing issues in. So why is measuring complexity important? I think we've covered it pretty well, but just to recap, it identifies tightly coupled sections of your application. All right, so things that talk to each other too much. It identifies methods that might not be clear due to excessive logic, right? So a lot of statements, it calls 15 other methods inside of itself. Just very hard, again, to hold in your state. Remember that, whoever comes behind you, even yourself, when you come back a week, a month, 6 months later, and this happens to us a lot, we might not touch some services or some node modules for months at a time. And so when we come back, if it's a very complex system or complex module, we're going to have a lot of difficulty ramping up and saying, wait a minute, what was that I was, how does this behave? And oh, great. So whoever actually dug up that link, I should have had that on hand. Thank you so much. Oh, again, you are on fire. Maria, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Maria? I hope so. Yes, nailed it. All right. Okay, so it identifies methods that might not be clear due to excessive logic, and it helps identify trends. So again, complexity is a good identifier of trend. Even if your code is formatted perfectly and looks great, you could still be experiencing increases in complexity or decreases. And again, this can help you track and say, oh, you know what, like, look, we're killing it on these projects. We're really cleaning them up. I think we have room to take on a little bit more, or it could be vice versa. Look at the complexity. These applications are starting to get really complex. Let's take a step back. Let's get a refactor sprint in, and something of that nature. Let's spend some time just trying to clean this up. So again, last one is coverage. So I want to start out real quick again and say that coverage is not equal to quality. So I know I said this before, but it's very important. Testing is a very deep subject, and you can write really bad tests and still end up with like 90% coverage on your code base. You could even end up with 100% technically, but you're not really testing the use cases that matter most. It's a very interesting dynamic on how that works, because really coverage is just reading to see which parts of your application get pulled in to really the tests, right? So you might pull in something and that line might be used, but you might only be testing the good paths of a particular thing, like signing up for, like registering for a webinar. And you might not test the bad paths, but yet because you've pulled in all that code, it's going to give you, on that little section, 80 to 90% coverage. But really, yeah, you're great if everything goes well and your tests will work right if you have the perfect data. But as soon as there's an edge case, an anomaly, or an unexpected error, you're going to be in trouble. So it's just to stress that coverage does not equal quality, but yet high coverage is still better than no coverage. All right, so lack of coverage still shows parts of the application that have no tests at all. And to me, the definition of legacy is an application that is not documented, tested, and that's pretty much it. Like if it doesn't have tests, it needs to have really great documentation. And if it doesn't have documentation, it really needs to have tests, right? Because again, tests are another layer of documentation. So I just want to stress that because I do consider it to be one of the 3 C's, but I don't want to advocate or seem like I'm advocating that you just need to get to a high test coverage. It's much better to have 30% coverage, but you know that you're testing the parts of your application that are most business critical and important, than it is to have 90% coverage, but really just skimming over the application and just doing a basic check on things, and not really getting down into some of the core processes that your application does. So why is coverage important? So it identifies obviously areas that are not tested. It identifies trends in test code addition ratios. So this will help you also, again, identify things like fatigue, identify maybe issues with maybe you've done a lot of onboarding, you brought on a whole slew of new developers, and you're starting to notice that test coverage is decreasing. But the amount of code being committed is greatly increasing. This is a great red flag to say, oh, I think we need to take a step back and maybe do like a little seminar on training internally and try and get everybody up to speed on our testing. I mean, and obviously also you can integrate this into your build and have it do it automatically, right? So if you get below a certain percent of coverage, it should fail your build. And it helps instill confidence in the application. So this is probably the biggest one. Internally as a developer working on it, like I said, when I make changes and I run the tests and I'm greenlit, I'm a lot more confident in those changes with decent coverage than I am without, regardless of the quality of the tests. If I have no tests and I run and I do it and I'm like, oh, I think it works, but at least I get some confidence that will allow me to move a bit faster if I do have coverage. So this brings us to the next step, which is actually setting these standards. So we know now code quality is important. We know what the different parts of quality can help us achieve, and pretty much how to segregate and how to isolate them and test these different parts. But now we have to actually pick a standard, set a standard, and work with it. And code quality is like the #1 cause for bike shedding. I don't know of anything else that's been discussed more than like 2 or 4 spaces, tabs versus spaces, single versus double quotes, trailing commas versus leading commas versus semicolons and no semicolons. Like the list goes on. Or we can call it Parkinson's law of triviality, right? Because at the end of the day, all of that is just trivial. It really doesn't matter. Like there's a difference between the ideal code base for you and the ideal code base for your company. The ideal code base for you is going to be, set up and linted the exact way that you want it. You're going to want, whatever it is that you want, and your team is going to want whatever it is that they want. It's very important that you don't waste time over trivial things like this. And so that might be writing down what everybody wants and then picking 2 or 3 of them. It might be you use a standard that is just set, so you don't have to make any changes, and you guys just say this one looks the best of them. That's my preferred method. But regardless, the one thing you don't want to do is waste time deciding how to format things. The whole time that you could be saving by doing this, you can just turn right around and waste by having, hour-long meetings about, spaces versus tabs. So there are a number of standards to pick from, right? So by standard, what I really mean is JavaScript style guide. Airbnb has one that is now community driven. Standard JS is one that is picking up a lot of steam that is also community driven. You have Google has a style guide that's not really like, so the Airbnb has an ESLint plugin. I'm actually getting ahead of myself. Let me slow down a bit. Basically, these are style guides that other people have said, hey, this is a nice way to write code. It'll make your apps clean and clear and easy to work through. You should go ahead and use this. So now you have different ways to integrate these different style guides into your project. There's a ton of tooling to do that, and we'll talk about integration in a minute. But basically, you have to come to an agreement on a standard. So you can roll your own if you want. You don't have to pick any of these. You can just pick a linting tool and just add the rules that you want. However, I would highly recommend just picking something that's used that works ideal for the, just try and get the ideals that your team is looking for and find one that works the best. But if it really gets down to 2 to 4 spaces, at some point you just make a decision and move on. Like, people might be upset for about 15 minutes, but let me tell you, like, they're not going to care really that they have to use, a semicolon. Or not, or lack of a semicolon. I keep saying that because standard JS has no semicolons, and I've been using that a lot lately. Okay, so you definitely need to come to an agreement on a standard. And then, once you have that standard and you've picked it, you need to enforce it. Because we can pick a standard, but if we're not enforcing it, then anybody's still free to just do what they want. So linting should be run during development. So you can do this a couple ways. There's editor plugins for most of your common linters like JSHint, ESLint, standard, all that. You can launch files and run those same linting tools, via something like Grunt or Gulp, etc. And then there's the third method of just manually, right? I've made changes, I've done that, and I want to do it. Oh, and there's also the fourth, pre-commit hooks. So you can always use a pre-commit hook to catch things like linting. It's actually a great practice. But because we tend to watch and use editor plugins so much, and we check it during our build, we don't do the git hooks. Here we go. Linting should break your build when it fails. I can't tell you how many times I have seen people integrate linting into their build, but then we'll just put like or true at the end. So if it exits and it's wrong, and they'll just continue to let it go, even though it doesn't pass linting. And the theory behind this is, and I'm sure some of you have heard this before, I'm not going to hold up the application because there's a missing semicolon. Like I'm not going to hold up release because the style is wrong. Sure, once or twice, that's fine. But what happens when you've basically wasted all of your time adding linting tools because we're now back into entropy, right? And we've now slipped to a point where we don't care. I've also been in environments where even the tests, there were known failing tests. And instead of somebody fixing them, which I eventually did and eventually moved on, they would just leave it. They knew they would fail and that was okay. And they would just release with failing tests. I know this might sound like a bit like, totalitarian, but really it's important that you break builds when things like linting, coverage, any of that stuff fails. Otherwise, there's no point in having it. There's no point. And that's it. Here we go. Doubling up on this because I feel it's so important and it happens so often. Broken builds should never be merged. If a build is broken, you take the time and you fix it, and everybody will love you for it later. When people come onto your project and it's beautiful and clean and easy to work through, people are going to go, whoa, like I'm so glad that I'm working on this, instead of basically running for the hills and looking for a new job. Because nobody wants to work on crappy old legacy code, right? And I say old, but that's not true. Nobody wants to work on crappy legacy code because it doesn't have to be old. If I write a new application tomorrow and it's undocumented and untested, technically it's a legacy because you have to come in and dig through it to figure out how to use it, right? It's something that people are going to push off. It's going to become a black box. Nobody's going to want to touch it. So you have to enforce the standard. If you don't enforce the standard, there's no sense in having it to begin with. So now we want to talk about integrating standards into your workflow. Just give me one quick second here. Okay, sorry about that. A bit of a stuffy nose from sinuses today. Okay, jumping back into it. So one of the first tools that I want to talk about integrating this is CodeClimate. So CodeClimate is a great tool that will actually, you hook it up through GitHub or, however you want, or actually you can go through CodeClimate and just add GitHub repos to it. And so basically they will read your linting configuration and grade your code. So as you can see here, I have some things that were moved around. I was messing around with some configuration. Actually, I was testing their duplication engine. So you see like a lot of these things jumping around in these numbers, but it's great because it shows you can check overall progress of every individual file and then of your application as a whole. And this is very important. So this now gives pretty much anybody who has access to this an easy way to go and see the state of an application. How well is this code base doing right now as far as code quality and test coverage. And so it gives you a great overview, and the more repositories that you add, you can then, that's how you can start to track these trends, right? So like if I start noticing a dip in some of our core services or something like that, that's an immediate red flag. And I can know that I need to stop and do some investigation there, which is fantastic. And so then what happens is so they integrate into your build. And so like if we come and we look here, so this is a Greenkeeper pull request that was merged because it's, here we go. Let's see if we can view the details of this. Oh man, because it's already merged, so my checks are gone. But you would see there that there were multiple checks, and what that means is statuses. So it would say code climate is green, and your build is green. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with having like build integrations in with GitHub. So then we know, like even before we merge, code climate will say, hey, your test coverage is getting low, or something fell below a B, right? And so then it will fail. Like if something gets below a B, it's going to fail my build. And so there we go. So I can do it externally through code climate, or you can run something like ESLint as part of your build. And funny enough, I actually do that too. But that's just to get the build to pass. I like code climate because it gives visibility on the pull request, and that's where everybody's at for the action, right? Like everybody goes to the pull request. So it's great because I get it there. Actually, I might have some pull requests that have some failed checks, actually, if I just jump here right quick, and then repositories, let's check out this one, pull request, here we go. So this will have the checks because there's actually a failed one. So this one does not have code climate on it, but you can see that my Circle CI build failed for this. So there was obviously an issue with this, my app in this version of ESLint. And so then you would have another one of these for code climate as well. And it would either be green or red depending on what had happened. There we go. So code climate is a fantastic tool. And it brings me up to my next one, which is HOUND CI. So HOUND CI is another SaaS or service that will, instead of like how code climate kind of gives you a grade and does like an overall, and you can view the details and go look from the PR and look at code climate and see what's going on. HOUND CI takes a different route where they actually do line comments in your pull request. And so they will actually show you right there, like this part is failing this check. And this is fantastic because now I have code climate saying, oh, hey, this might fail, but even if it passes, it still might fail if HOUND discovers something, right? I mean, generally they'll have the same config, so it might be a bit overkill to have both on the same project. But I do love the line diffs, even if I'm using code climate, because I don't have to change context and go to code climate. I can get the diff right there in GitHub, and it's great. It just comments right on a line of code and says, oh, you missed a semicolon, or oh, you should use single quotes here, and it will fail your build. And then another service that I'm just starting to investigate is called CODECOV, which, like code climate, handles code coverage, but that's all that they do. But they take a different approach to it where you can compare coverage across commits, across branches. So it's pretty interesting how they handle it. I haven't decided whether or not to make the move to just HOUND CI and CODECOV. I'm still on code climate. One of the biggest things that's pushing me though is that I've started to use standard, and it's pretty, the whole point I'm using standard is because you just install it and you're done. And with ESLint and other configurations, you generally have to like set up 3 or 4 things to get it going and working correctly. And so I'm trying to eliminate that complexity. However, if I use standard with code climate, I end up having to add back that complexity. So it doesn't really give me any benefit yet. So I'm still holding off until either code climate has better support for standard, which I'm waiting to hear back from, or I'm going to switch to just HOUND and CODECOV. because those should be able to do the trick. And I can then stop using code climate. So a point to be taken here is you should always be looking for tools to improve your process, streamline things, increase velocity. And you can use these in your personal projects. A lot of these services, actually all three of the ones that I just showed, are free for open source. You only pay if you're doing private repositories. So the great thing about that is you can set up a couple test repositories and add these services and show it off to your teams and get their opinions and their feedback on it for free. And then when you come to a decision, then you can integrate and go private and paid. And this will save you money in doing your research and development. But always be on the lookout for new tools and better tooling. And in the JavaScript world, that's pretty much every day. I mean, I could do a whole webinar just on filtering technology and just knowing what to be aware of. All right, so that covers pretty much how to integrate it, how, we've talked about how to pick a standard, we've talked about why that they are important. And so, really that just opens us up to Q&A. If there's any questions or anybody wants more clarification on anything, now would be, the time to go ahead and evolve on some of those topics. All right, so I'm just going to let that sit for about a minute, see if any questions filter in. In the meantime, this is part one of a 4, maybe about to be a 5-part series. Most likely it will. I'll add one on testing. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about code discovery. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to come back. We're going to talk about securing your environment and deploying with Docker, both things that will greatly improve your Node workflow and allow you to move through applications much faster. Yeah, filtering tools, a +1 on that as well. Okay, cool. So maybe I'll, take a look at that. Yeah, basically what that boils down to is building your own technology radar. And so a great jumping off point for that, I'm looking it up right now. A great company called ThoughtWorks. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with them or not, but they have a tech radar. So the basis of what I would be talking about stems, there we go, stems from this. So I'm adding a link to that as well, so people can start to familiarize with that. But that's basically a neat pattern or practice on how to stay up with emerging technologies. Yeah, it's really great. Let's see. So also, I'm going to be speaking at O'Reilly Software Architecture Conference coming up in November. I'm going to be doing a 90-minute presentation on architecting for enterprise in Node.js. It's going to take some of these core ideas that we're going to discuss in these webinars, but put it together in a much more how to get from code to deployment kind of playbook. Sure. So I got a question coming in. Can I repeat how I stay up on emerging technologies again? Yes, I can. Give me 1 second. So I'm actually going to copy this link and bring it to where everyone can see it. Okay, so ThoughtWorks has what's called the technology radar. So what they do is they look at technologies that are coming in. And so they come onto the radar as we're aware of it. We're aware that this technology is new. We know that it's there. So then what they start to do is if they start to see build up for it and they start to see people using it in trends, then they say, okay, now it's under the investigation phase. So what they'll do is on 1 or 2 smaller projects or something, they'll try out this new tool, idea, language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then if that goes well and it goes past their investigation phase, the next time a project comes up that has the requirements that meet that technology, they'll try it in a bigger setting, production, and then they give it the thumbs up. Like, okay, this is good to go. It's a trusted technology. So essentially, you just want to do that same thing, but you're just going to minimize the scope to just Node.js and maybe just tools for a while. And so maybe I'll do another session on that because that alone is another trick that saves me a ton of time. So basically I just have a no filter Twitter feed that I use where I follow everyone and anything that concerns me development wise. I found that to be one of the most resourceful. And then obviously staying up on, with newsletters and things like that. And so then you just start to pick and pull. You'll start to see things repeat. I generally don't even look at something until I see it pop up in 2 or 3 places. Once I've seen it in Twitter, in a newsletter, and people I know and trust are writing about it on Medium, now I'll start to talk about it or think about it. And then, and I'll start to put it on my radar, right? And then if momentum for it builds, I'll move it into the testing phase and try it out if it's something that I feel like we would have a need for. And if that goes well, then I look for a project where it makes sense to apply it. But just because you have a hammer doesn't mean everything is a nail. It's very important to remember that you should be very diligent when you're trying out these new technologies and testing them. Introducing new tools at too high of a rate can have a really bad effect on your team or teams. It can create a lot of confusion. People become very unclear about what the best practice is or the right way to do things. And the whole point of this is to improve the process and streamline workflows to create better code and better velocity. And so that wraps up our slideshow. I do have one other note that I would like to mention, which is that MLS is actually hiring. So we're actually hiring for a junior JavaScript engineer right now. So I would love, if anybody's interested, I would love to get your information. And so I'm going to add my email right here in chat right now. So if you're interested, this is a junior role, but if you are interested, please reach out to me, email me, and we can get the discussion going. I believe you can direct message me on Twitter as well. And on Twitter, I am just at Curtis Kemple. Oops, sorry about that little single quote there. But yeah, so you can just hit me up on Twitter as well. So we are definitely looking. It's a great place to work, and if any of the things that I've talked about today have interest to you, then it sounds like MLS might be a good fit. Where's our linter? Okay, so actually, we have some time. Real quick. So, thank you, Terrence. Yeah, so linters. So I talked about JS standards. So let me jump back. 2 of the most standard is different. It's a style guide and the linter pretty much wrapped up into one. So basically you install standard and that's all you have to do. You just run standard. There's no configuration. This is again why I'm loving it so much. You just put it in and you go. You're either happy with how they style things or you're not. Where's our linter? Yeah, got it, Joanne. But hey, you just brought up a great topic, and now we're looking at linters. So it's great because you just set it and forget it. So you can just npm install it. You're done. You just add a lint. I like to lint on pre-test. I'll add a pre-test npm script and just make sure it runs lint, and you're good to go. So that is right now becoming my air quote standard. And then the one that I was using before this was the Airbnb JavaScript style guide. So the reason that I picked this one is because it's actually now pretty much developed by the community. And so I feel that if enough people in the community are using it, it also means onboarding would be easier, right? Like, I could do some minor changes, but anybody who's used to using this config can jump into any one of my projects and understand pretty much how it's styled and how the code is structured, which I think is a great thing. And it's the same thing for standard. It's becoming the de facto. And so if you're using one of these, chances are you're going to have, you know, a much easier time adding new developers. But Airbnb does not run by itself. You actually have to use a linter and then extend it. And the linter that I use it with is actually ESLint. I believe it just popped up and went away. ESLint.org. Cool, great. So there's also JSHint. The one thing I like about ESLint now over JSHint is two things. ESLint is pluggable, so you can actually add a linting engine to do pretty much anything, which is fantastic, but then it will also lint on its own. The flip side to this is complexity. Because it's pluggable, you have to plug in the linter that you want to use, the config you want to use. Cool. All right. So Michael, great question. Give me 1 second. I'm going to get to that in just 1 second. All right, so yeah, so so it adds a bit of complexity. It's not that big of a deal. I'm a huge fan of yeoman and generators. So I don't know. Let's see, yeoman should pop up. Here we go. So basically, Yeoman is a tool that allows you to bootstrap projects very quickly. You'll see a lot of this all over the internet with scaffolding, Angular, and React apps and things of that nature. So because I scaffold projects to start, we have like a base web service, a base node module generator, and stuff like that. A lot of these things just get added by default, but getting started with ESLint can be a pain because it does take quite a bit of setup, which is again why I'm starting to move to standard. Because you just, npm install it and you're done. So I'm going to get to Michael's question here. And the question is, what's your opinion on people using newer ES6 features when the rest of the team is a bit slower on picking it up? This is a very tough question. And it's definitely going to vary between your team. However, I do think that it is important to increase velocity. And so if the savings that you get from using ES6 features, like less lines of code, once it's picked up, I find it a bit easier to work through, and others have as well once you understand the changes in syntax and functionality. I think it's great, but it is a fine line because if the team is too slow at picking it up, you're hurting velocity for a while. Now it will pick up, right? Once they do pick it up and they get it, you're going to increase velocity. So what I try and do is I try and limit the features and use this as a good teaching lesson here for you and for your team as well. This is a great chance to actually yourself set up an internal webinar or a lunch and learn and pick one ES6 feature, describe it, explain it, and start using that in your code base. And then as your team starts to adopt it, add a new ES6 feature, add another ES6 feature. And so it can be a bit time consuming, but you can start easy, right? Like it's pretty easy to explain to people fat arrow functions if you just take that and just that, right? Like it's easy to digest one piece. And you could go over that in an hour and have everyone understand it. And then you could move on to like object destructuring and string templating. You can show them that. You show them how it compares to other languages too, to help broaden the scope and get those wheels turning. But what I wouldn't do is just start bombing in all ES6 features. Because that's just going to create confusion. You're hurting the clarity, and you're adding complexity, not complexity in the cyclomatic complexity, but the complexity of now they have to maintain the state of the application and try and maintain the state of remembering what these ES6 features are. So it kind of doubles the complexity on your team. But you do want to integrate them, and you don't want to let them hold up the progress of the application or even of yourself. So you need to start introducing them, but you just want to do it gradually. I hope that was helpful. All right, so I'm going to give this another minute or two. Great. Okay, cool. Glad to know. I'm going to give it another minute or two to see if any more questions filter in. And if not, we'll call this a wrap and we'll regroup tomorrow. And remember, no question is a stupid question, guys. Anything you want to know, even if it's off topic, throw it out and I'll see if I can help you. I should have brought some like elevator music or like birds chirping. Interesting. Okay, so how about using tools like Labab to ease into learning ES6? Well, I have to be quite honest with you. I don't know what Labab is, so I am Googling it right now. And Labab, okay, so it's a transpiler. It does exactly the opposite of what Babel does. Fantastic. That's great. Okay. Yeah, I think that's fantastic. That's a great idea. And you can also kind of see what output you can get from the Babel REPL, which is also good. So here, let me bring this up real quick. So this is what I'll do a lot of times if I'm unsure about like what Babel will output. Now this is not the same thing as what Maria just shared. Hers is great. So it's going to take ES6 and convert it to like clean ES5 for you. But the Babel REPL will do pretty much the same thing, except it's showing you like the Babel generated output, but it is again the ES5 output. So you can paste anything you want in over to the left, and then it will output what it would be in ES5 on the right. And a great thing about this, let's see, who was asking about this before? Michael, right. So a good thing about this, Michael, is you could actually use this to explain ES6 features, because then you can show them a side-by-side comparison and say, so here's how, lexical scope is handled with fat arrow functions, and like, here's what this is, and then this is the equivalent in, no more var self equals this, like you can show them what it's saving to. And generally when this is a very good point, hang on. So whenever you want to add something or get buy-in on something, you have to look at how it can, like what the stakeholders want from it, right? Like what does a stakeholder care about? And in this case, with the case of your team, you might be saving them from writing things that are repetitive, or from doing the var.self equals this, or however you handle doing handling passing of scope. But point being is that you have to present it to them in a way in which it's beneficial for them to use, because otherwise people aren't going to want to buy into it. It's very hard to get people enthused about things. A lot of times people are very resistant to change. But you can use this same methodology in understanding the stakeholders and understanding what they want out of something. For a lot of these things, you want to use Code Climate, but they're telling you that they just can't afford the cost. Put it to them in terms that make sense to them. Code Climate equals better quality, equals more feature releases, equals less time to market for XYZ, right? Like you have to always turn it into something that stakeholders care about, whoever the stakeholder may be. All right. I think that's it. I think we're going to wrap up here. This was a great session. I'm really happy with how it went. I hope you guys are too. Now would be a great time if you want to just go ahead to the poll. Let me know how you felt the seminar went, and then feel free to submit questions and topics. You can do that as well under the questions and topics tab. And maybe I'll spend 5 minutes in the beginning of the next one recapping any missed questions or things from the first episode. These are also being recorded, so I believe that they'll be available to you after the event, so you can always come back. And again, the slides are on SlideShare, so you can always reference the slides as well. All right, guys. Well, I had a great time. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to tomorrow, and I hope to see you guys all there. Have a good night.